Are you struggling to create an intentional headspace? Are you unable to connect deeper with yourself? Come, and together, let's address the elephant in the room. I'm your host, Sinead Roche, and this is the Uncomfortable Podcast. Okay, so today I want to talk about being the problem. And honestly, this one is hard to admit that sometimes we ourselves are the problem. And I think it's hard to admit it, especially when you consider yourself to be like an emotionally intelligent person. But just because like you have emotional intelligence doesn't mean that sometimes like you can't act out of character. You can't act in a toxic way. Like you still can. Like everyone still has the potential to. But yeah, it kind of sucks acknowledging it that in some cases, like you were the one who did other people dirty, or that even worse, you did yourself dirty. And yeah, I want to talk about that today. The kind of first scenario that I realized it in, and this is kind of, I guess, one of my like turning point moments where I kind of saw myself in a different view, was in high school when my best friend got together with another friend of mine, and they're still together today, which I'm really excited about. But yeah, during that process, I was not the best person. Let's say it like that. So just to give you guys a bit of more context, I met my best friend in high school during my junior year at lacrosse, and junior year of lacrosse, she moved up. So she was a year younger than me, so she was a sophomore at the time. She moved up to varsity, and I was a goalie in lacrosse, and I needed someone to warm me up, and she was the first person to warm me up. And gradually, because like you're talking to this person every day, whatever we had practice, you just become closer naturally. And what ended up happening is we became so close, we started doing everything together, and it was a lot of fun. It was really exciting, and yeah. I think it's at one point though it becomes a bit unhealthy, like when you're that close to a person, but mind you, you're still in high school, and I mean, sometimes like people just have like unhealthy patterns in the way they create friendships. But yeah, that's what kind of how we got together and how we became really good friends. And at the same time as I was playing lacrosse, I also did track. I was not good. I'm gonna be very honest, I was not. So my senior year, I had convinced her, hey, you should join track with me. It'll be fun. So my senior year, we were both doing lacrosse and track, which is a lot of time spent together. But yeah. And my senior year in track, her soon-to-be boyfriend joined as well. And he and I became friends before they started talking or anything like this. And like it was really chill. And when they ended up getting together, whew, that was bad. That was bad. Like I took it really hard and took it really personal, because her and I used to hang out all the time. Now another person is coming into her life, and that means she has to make time for him, which meant cutting down on my time. But I mean, that's just how it works. That's natural, right? And I didn't realize it then. I only realized it like I think a year after that. I was like, shit, I was bad. I was a bad friend. And I was acting really toxic because when they were getting together, I used a lot of emotional manipulation. Yeah. It's kind of sad. Not even kind of, it is sad to think about it, because what I used to do is that I would like gaslight her into thinking she wasn't spending enough time with me, that she was making so much time like for him, and it didn't feel like our friendship was there anymore. And yeah, it was ugly. Like there was a point like we really weren't talking anymore, or we would just like get into fights constantly because I was instigating it. And I think some of it came from like me being jealous of her having a relationship and me not having one. But also like me just being jealous of the fact that someone else was taking her time away. And yeah, I was being really toxic in that situation. And I mean, even to this day, I still sometimes like, we'll talk about it and I'll be like, I'm so sorry, man. Like, I don't know how you put up with me, but thank you so much for like the grace that you gave me like during that time. Because I was being really selfish and I wasn't being empathetic enough. and putting myself in your shoes of how you felt, because now you're bringing this other person in, but of course, like, you still want to be friends with me, like, things like this. Like, I just wasn't being considerate. And I really took advantage of her kindness at that moment. And to her, I'm so sorry, but I'm so thankful that we're still friends. But yeah, I was being toxic at that moment. And I'm not going to say I'm a toxic person necessarily. Like, it's not that it's in my nature necessarily to, like, I guess, manipulate others. I think that's what I think it means to be toxic. But in that moment, for sure. Being self-aware enough to, like, know that I was bad in that situation was really hard, because I kind of felt shy going back to that, like, friendship still, and, like, afterwards, like, a year afterwards, and being, like, having that conversation with her, because I felt shy. I was like, man, I'm really sorry I did that to you. And I kind of, like, walked towards her, like, in my mind, like, with my head tucked behind my ears. But I don't think realizing I was toxic to others was as hard as, like, realizing that I was toxic to myself in certain scenarios. And I feel like that's worse when you realize that, like, you're not just, like, hurting others. I feel like it's, like, worse when you realize, like, you've hurt yourself as well in certain things. And the scenario that I realized was, like, when I was with another person, and we were romantically together, and I realized that situation, like, throughout, I would constantly tell myself, like, oh, man, like, this really isn't it, and I continue to stay in, like, within that space, though, with this person. Like, I would tell myself, like, I deserve better, or, I would tell myself I deserved better, or that things weren't working out, and then I would still stay, you know? And looking back at it now, like, you know, when we ended and everything like this, I was talking to a friend, and I had told him, like, you know, maybe in a few years I'll admit that, like, what was going on was toxic. And he told me, like, why don't you think it was toxic, like, now? And I told him, like, I don't want to admit it. I don't want to admit that I played a part in that toxicity, because for me, like, from my end, what I, like, going back now, like, and looking at other things, I realized I stayed there because I think definitely has a lot to do with, like, my attachment style. Like, I have an anxious attachment style, which is where, like, you get scared when someone wants to leave, and, like, you just want to always get closer to the person. But like, I didn't want to admit it because, like, oh, you know, like, I don't want to take any part in it. Like, I don't want to take any part in any of it. But we were toxic, and it wasn't just, like, as, like, together, like, even individually, like, and just from my point of view, like, just on myself speaking, I was toxic to myself, because I continued to allow myself to be in a state where it wasn't beneficial towards me, and it wasn't, like, a peaceful, like, place to be in. Like, I stayed in something that had me acting really reactive in a lot of situations, and it wasn't like there was, like, no reassurance there. And I knew that. That's the worst thing. Like, I knew there was no reassurance. I knew this person wasn't gonna change, and I stayed. And not to say that there was, like, oh, okay, like, you know, there's nothing else on, like, other person's part that they also did, but, like, on my own thing, like, just speaking from my own perspective, my own experience, like, I definitely played a huge part as to why that prolonged as long as it did. And I guess, like, after looking at everything, the worst thing is feeling like I'm not adding up to who I said I was. Like, because this isn't just, like, a scenario in which, like, oh, it's, like, a small thing that goes against who you are. No, this was a big thing. Like, one of, like, I guess my key values is that I don't stay in situations that, like, are toxic for me, or I don't let myself, like, continue on with, like, friendships or relationships that are negative and not beneficial to me. And that's exactly what I did. And because of this, like, for, like, a good week, during, like that after period, I experienced a lot of cognitive dissonance, and that's when like a person's behaviors and a beliefs, like they don't coincide. And so like it's really contradictory. So like the entire time I'm thinking like, oh, like I'm a person who like knows their value. So like when I see something is not adding up to my value, I will leave it. But then realizing I didn't do that was like, damn. Like it was bad. It was bad because I was like, for a good week there, I was like, shoot, like I knew all of this, and not only did I know it like at that moment, like I went back and I went through my notes. Like I think most women do this, where like you'll just like write notes down about like your feelings and things like this. So like when you'll rant a paragraph, I think I had like 20 paragraphs about like, Sinead, like this isn't serving you, leave it. Like I knew it, but I didn't act on like my actual knowledge of things. I just continued to act with my emotions of things, and that comes from like other trauma, and still wanting someone's attention and wanting to be chosen by someone for sure, right? But I still remained somewhere where it was being toxic towards myself, and I think realizing that, man, again, like I was saying, during that week, I was like really confused about myself. And at the same time, I was really like hating on myself. And the thing is, we're going to mess up. I think as humans, like it's just natural for us to mess up. You can be a good person, consider yourself a really good person, and you're going to mess up. Like it just happens. We're humans, we err, like we're not God. Like it just happens, but you have to be able to cope with it healthily afterwards so that you don't get yourself down, like, and you're constantly thinking like, oh, because of like I stayed in one toxic scenario, because I was toxic to myself once, like I'm gonna continue that pattern. No, and I think especially once you realize it, that's when you have to take the actions to make sure that you don't fall into that habit, to make sure that you're aware next time that a situation like this comes up, and not just be like in a relationship toxic, but like when you're toxic to yourself in a relationship, but other scenarios as well. Like maybe it's like staying in a workplace too long, that you know you don't like it there anymore, but you're gonna continue to stay, like even though you've written yourself all of these things. Like it's important because the next steps that you take in your life, like you hope that they don't reflect the same path that you had, the same path that didn't work out for you. And kind of like my steps in this, like realizing that I was part of like the problem, realizing that I was toxic to myself because I had realized different things, but I just wasn't acting on them because my emotions, especially like my fear of losing someone, was really high. Like the first thing I did was I apologized to myself. Even now that I say it, like it's weird. Yeah, I apologized to myself, because it's not that I used everything else as an excuse, like the reasons why I stayed there, like to excuse my own behavior, but like it was just simply to say like, I'm sorry that I kept you in a situation where I knew you were better, like where I knew you deserved better, but because you had all of these anxious attachments and because you had this other fear of no one else seeing your worth, and because you wanted to prove yourself, like, I'm sorry. And that took another like 2 weeks, honestly, to like let that sink into myself, that I had to apologize to myself because I also played a role in my own unhealthy patterns, I guess. Yeah. And after that, like what I did, I guess in order to like understand what was happening and understanding that this had happened and not avoiding it, because I think that's one of the worst things you can do. Like if you continue to avoid something, like at one point it's going to come, it's going to trigger you. So you might as well just get through it at that moment. What I did was I started assessing myself. And that's why I started to assess like my traumas of like, okay, why did I feel the need to stay in something that was unhealthy for myself, where I already acknowledged that it was unhealthy. And I realized that that's kind of where I said, and I'll say it often, that I feel like I'm an emotionally driven person. So I let my emotions lead, even if my logic, it doesn't coincide. And I had to assess my patterns in that sense as well, because like I said, like my beliefs just weren't adding up with my actions. I would let the love that I have for this person carry over more than the love that I had for myself. And I would let I guess the endorphins rush that they gave me, because when they wanted me, it felt nice. I would let that carry over more than when I was crying at night, or when I was really reactive in certain situations. I would let that emotion and those memories take over more than the negative ones. And I think most of us do that, right? But that's not being realistic, and that's not having an entire holistic view of what's going on. So I really had to assess my own patterns, realize why they came, where did they come from? Where did me wanting attention, where did that come from, and how do I kind of get rid of that? I had to assess that. And that was heartbreaking in the sense that I realized a lot of my own flaws, and maybe flaws is not the right word, but I realized a lot of my own wounds, I would say. And I realized how I led by these wounds, how I let them control my actions. And that meant that, at the beginning of I guess a year ago or something, that's when everything started. I felt like I was in a great place and everything like this, but specifically in this example, I feel like when you're with someone else, things that you didn't know were hurting you, they come out, right? And if you're not aware of them, it's really hard to maneuver around them and not let them control you. So yeah, all this to say that after you apologize to yourself, make sure that you also assess yourself and you take your patterns into considerations. You take the reasons why you have these patterns into consideration. And then afterwards, and I think this is where it got worse for me, is I asked my best friend who was there throughout the entire time. I asked her so what were your thoughts on me at the time? And not to take someone else's perspective and put it and prioritize it more than my own, but just to get more insight on a person who I really think knows me well, what her thoughts were. And she said to me, she's at one point I stopped asking what you were doing, because it seemed like the person who you were outside of this other person was completely different with this person. So she was basically saying to me that I held my values outside of this person, but with this person I was acting really irrational and not in accordance with my beliefs. And it was really strange to me, because I also had another conversation with a different friend, and he told me Shania, you don't put up with so much BS from others the way you put up with BS for this person. And I was that's what really occurred to me, that my insecurity of something was actually driving me to be really toxic, and in other cases where had it been another person, it wouldn't have affected me the same way, right? And having to hear this from my two of my closest friends was really damn. People who are around you a lot, they actually do start to pick up on your patterns. They do start to realize what's going on. It's not to say that they know you fully, and not to say, once again, don't prioritize their opinion of you necessarily, but do take that into consideration. And when I took that into consideration, I was yeah, I could have definitely done better. But that happens. And when it came from other people, hearing that they also saw me being toxic to myself, one thing I didn't do is I didn't allow myself to regret things, right? And I didn't allow myself to go back and see, okay, maybe I could have done this. No, because I feel that would have eaten up more at me. So I just stopped that thought process immediately. I feel for others, if that helps you, if it helps to go back and to replay the actions, replay the experience, and do something actually that's within accordance with your values, so you're not acting toxic to yourself. If that helps you to understand that you still had the option in that case, then great. But for me, it would feel like digging, I was just digging a hole deeper within myself, and I just didn't want to do that. So basically, those are the steps that I took after realizing that. So again, apologizing to myself, assessing my own patterns, asking others for their feedback. And again, like when I was assessing myself, I saw lots of my triggers. I saw a lot of my, I had to ask myself, what were these traumatic experiences that was causing me to act like this? And it sucked. It definitely did. Like I said, like you don't know you had some of those wounds, but I think going through that process and becoming very self-aware of yourself, and I mean very self-aware, to the point where it's like excruciatingly painful to see that you acted in certain ways because now you know the reasons why you acted like that. I think it's important though, because the next steps I take, the next time I put myself in a certain situation, doesn't necessarily have to be like a relationship, like ideology or like scenario, but like in any situation where like I feel like the pattern of being toxic to myself is there, like at least I know why. And then hopefully like I have it within me to change that pattern. I have it within me to change my ways and my manners and my actions towards myself. And at the end of like kind of assessing all of this and realizing, okay, yeah, I was part of the problem for my own sake. Like, seek compassion for yourself. Seek compassion for yourself. Like, don't be so hard on yourself to the point where you're like, shoot, like I really fucked up. No, man, like it's bad in the moment. It definitely is. It definitely is. But, and especially like afterwards, yeah, realizing everything, it's still bad, but that doesn't mean like it ended. That doesn't mean that your life isn't continuing anymore, that you won't have other opportunities to act in a different manner. Because you know what? I think that's the thing. Like at one point, whether you believe in fate or God or whoever you believe in, your higher power, I do believe like at one point, like you're presented with another opportunity in which you could act the same way that you did in the past, right? But if you actually worked on yourself, you will be able to realize what's going on. And that is an opportunity for you to step up for yourself. So yes, afterwards I gave myself compassion because I knew that next time that I realize like I'm doing this to myself, next time I'll have understood myself even more to the point where I'll be able to walk away from something. I'll be able to say no to myself, even when the emotions are hurting in that moment, right? Because I think at one point what you have to realize, most things are temporary. So those emotions that you have that might be leading you, they're temporary. They're within that moment. But who you want to be, who you think you are, I guess like your values, like and your beliefs, those are constant. Like, and being consistent with them is very difficult when temporary emotions are coming into play, temporary people are coming into play and impacting that. But again, once you become really aware, and I know I'm being really repetitive right now, but like once you become really aware, once you actually put the work into going into your past and reliving certain experiences that you don't want to relive, but understanding what was behind them, I think you're able to change what you're going to do in the future. And at the end of the day, I think when it comes to, as you build up this awareness for yourself, right? And as you build up the self-compassion for yourself afterwards, at the end of the day, like just because you are a different person now, or just because you have other habits now, doesn't mean that you shouldn't accept the responsibility that about what happened in the past. Like, because for me now, like I can tell you my values remain the same in the sense that like I don't want to be toxic to myself. And I can also tell you that like in the future I'm not going to be acting like this, or I'm hoping I'm not going to be acting like this. But at the same time, I can tell you that I do accept responsibility for some of the pain that I've caused myself. And I think that's important because then I think it's also like easier to apologize to yourself in some instances. And then when it comes to not just being toxic to yourself, but also being toxic to others, when you're able to accept the responsibility, it becomes easier to talk to others and tell them like, listen, I'm sorry about this. I assess why this happened to myself. Like these steps aren't just about like when you're toxic to yourself, but also when you're toxic to others, and being able to I was going to say repent for them, but being able to accept them and being able to move forward, even though you've done this, right? Which is why I want to say, like, I've been saying this entire time, I acted toxic. Not that I was toxic. I didn't internalize just my actions onto me, because I feel like when you say that, like, yeah, I am toxic, you become that. And I wasn't. I'm not. I just acted like that. It's like saying I'm happy. No, I'm acting happy, or like for right now I'm happy. Like, you're not always gonna be happy, but if that makes sense. Feel free to let me know if that doesn't make sense in the comments. But yeah, so this entire experience for me was really difficult to come to terms with, especially, like I said, because you have to do the work on yourself. But I think moving forward, it will really help me in the way that I navigate certain situations, and being able to understand why I do certain things in certain situations as well. But basically, now that we've come to the end, I want to give you guys the question I want you guys to ask yourselves, which is if you have ever acted in a toxic manner, what is the feeling that you associate when you are toxic? And I feel like I want to ask you that question because again, if you're really emotionally driven, then you should be aware of, like, what's the emotion that triggers your, like, manipulation towards yourself, or like you harming yourself or even harming others. Like, so again, if you're ever acting in a toxic manner and you realize it, what's the emotion that you associate it with? And then I want you to ask yourself, in what situations is this happening mostly? Thank you guys so much for listening.